No, it's yours.
Okay, great. So can I get going? All right. Hi. Thank you for bringing me here. Yeah. Thank you all for attending. That's already a great honor for me. So just by way of introduction, I'm the Lighthouse Professor and Chair of Digital Cultures here at Technische Universität Dresden. I kind of just arrived a couple months ago from Canada. And I'm a historian of science by training, actually. So not from the usual media, but I do science technology studies and history of science. And my research integrates the study of cybernetics, cognitive, neuro, and human sciences with design and the arts to document a history. So how would we think about a history of our contemporary discourses and practices of big data, interactivity, environmental computing, particularly responsive environments. So one of the things that really interests me is what we like to call, because I worked a lot in East Asia and places like Korea, ubiquitous computing. So what does it mean when computing is embedded, right, in every feature of our lives? And it's not just cell phones, right? Like, I love to pull these things out. You know, it's not just the fact that we have this on us all the time, right? And we sense our environment every time you use Google Maps or you walk around. Like, we're constantly, right, online. And we're constantly using computational power. And every time you're getting on a phone, maybe you have medical devices attached to yourself. Maybe you live in a smart house. Maybe your car is all networked. So I'm interested at what another media theorist, Benjamin Bratton, calls planetary scale computing. Is like, what happens when the computing actually is in our environment? And not only that, how have we started to think, you're media studies scholars, right? How have we started to think about the environment itself as a medium? Think about geoengineering or terraforming. Right now, we're at a state, or even this building. Right now, we're standing in a building with building management systems, the air conditioning. This is a smart building, I'm assuming. I'm seeing a lot of sensors. There's probably temperature control, heat control, ventilation. All sorts of systems are being run, and all of them are being run computationally. We don't usually think about that as places to think about digital media, right? The environment or infrastructure, but that's exactly what I study. And so today I'm going to talk about, so I have a book coming out called The Smartness Mandate with Robert Mitchell from Duke University, and it's coming from MIT Press. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of the smartness mandate, how everything became smart, our environments, our phones, I don't know there's smart. I bought a smart vacuum cleaner yesterday. It's amazing. Anyway, it tells me how smart. It tells me exactly how many particles in the air and whatever, and how dirty my house is. I don't know if it cleans it, but it tells me this information. And obviously, we have smart. We have all these Fitbits, quantitative self, all these things, right? Are stuff that we think about in this book. How did we get so smart? And today I'm going to tell you a little story about this smartness that isn't no one can tell a full history, of course. There are so many complicated histories of computing and digital media, but for me, the important thing about history and why we even do it is because, by telling histories of the past, we can start understanding that the world didn't always look the same and it won't always look the same in the future. So it's about imagining new ways to think about technology and to design and engineer technology in the future. It's also about thinking about how we deal with, about analyzing how power and knowledge, race, sex, gender all operate in digital media and through technology. So I'm interested in what I label the smartness mandate. And as part of that, of course, I study lots of smart things. So this is Sangdo, South Korea. It's a smart city that I've spent like a lot of time studying. It's great. This is its fake little Central Park, and And it's part of it's called a greenfield city. That's to say it's a city that's built out of nothing. And these things are pretty common in China, South Korea, Asia in general. These cities are rolled out, and they're what we call in architectural and urban planning parlance a spatial product. I know it sounds crazy to imagine that today people are selling products for that where 1 million people can inhabit them, but they will sell you a city. And this city is being built by Cisco, which is a large network provider from San Francisco. And it's being built by POSCO, a Chaebol, which is a Korean conglomerate, much in keeping with a kind of German conglomerate corporate model that does mostly steel refinery and development. And it's part of an internet of a free economic zone. So the interesting thing about Korea is that every single part of Korea is actually an exemption to Korean law. It's a free trade zone. They have 26 free trade zones. Every part of the country has another free trade. So it's kind of a fascinating exemplar of how people are trying to incentivize development and economy. And I'm pointing that out. You might be like, why do I have to hear about this? So these greenfield cities are part of a global network. Here's a whole series of smart cities being rolled out by Cisco, ranging from Africa to Malaysia to Delhi, Mumbai. So there's all sorts of these smart and connected. And Siemens, IBM, all these corporations right now are in a global war that you may not even be conscious of, but you might start to feel it because we fight right now today. Infrastructure is geopolitical, right? We know that because we have a war right now over gas pipelines. But right now there's a global rush, literally. China is building what we call the Belt Road, and I do a lot of work on the Belt Road. I don't know how many people have heard about this. The Belt Road Initiative, where China is trying to literally hook up the whole world. And a big part of that is actually about computation. It's about everything being smart. It's about having all the logistics talk to each other. It's about being able to control space and time through technology. So there are these, so digital technologies come with new types of territory and new types of geopolitics. And these are some of the areas, and every one of these cities is a free trade zone. So it's a particular type of economy. And in fact, in Sangdo, it's a utopia. It's the global business utopia of Incheon. And Incheon, incidentally, and this beautiful smart city is the back end, is the front end, the kind of shiny, beautiful part of an entire landscape of infrastructures for moving people and things, particularly things. So there's a new port being built in Incheon that you see down here that will supplant Busan. These are some of the biggest ports in the world, and they're entirely automated. I mean, one of the things, if you go on these ports, and I visited them, there's like no people except in the trucks. And even those they hope to have drone and kind of robotically operated soon. And of course, the Incheon airport, one of the largest in East Asia. So these are these corporations these are these spatial products that are being rolled out and produced by high-tech companies and leveraged through finance capital. And you know they're all over the world. And they're also zones, as I mentioned, of exclusion, or as Keller Easterling posits, extra statecraft. So there are new types of power, right? There's a new types of geopolitics happening around these zones. And they're often, like I said, the shiny, beautiful interfaces to basically these logistical backends. So it's a little bit like Hamburg looks really nice, and then there's Hamburg Port. And I actually do a lot of work right now on the Hamburg Port, another place where you probably wouldn't think of too much about computing, but it's actually an extremely automated infrastructure. So what interests me in all is in all this marketing. So all of these cities have these really shiny, really cheesy, bad ads. like all of them. They're just terrible. They're ugly little things like this that say, that basically are kind of marketing economic growth, you can see, and sustainability with the sort of greenness, right? So eternal growth will accompany greenness, all provided through our computers. So we have this new kind of equation, which I don't really know how we came up with, because I'm sure you all know that computing wastes a lot of energy, where bandwidth as rates of bits transferred between connections in a unit of time has come to equal sustainability, has come to equal life itself. So it's really interesting, whatever disaster, whether it's a military, security, environmental, etc., we respond to by being like, more computing is going to somehow save us. It's a fascinating thing, and as a historian, I want to find out how we've come to think that bandwidth equals life. How did that happen? So what I'm really interested in all this marketing is how, of course, this equation has developed. But I'm also interested in the fact that behind all these nice cities, of course, is a kind of ominous. So behind this marketing, right, of bandwidth equals life, there's sort of an ominous future coming in. Why? For starters, of course, what all these marketing cedes to is that there is going to be there is a climate crisis, and in fact, these are responding to the climate crisis. So there's this sort of future that's going to happen that's not so great. And not only that, in the case of this city, it was actually grafted from the South China Sea. So it's at sea or below sea level. So it's a great risk despite all its harmonious green. And in fact, the UN's environmental division for East Asia is located there, and it's all wonderful, except that it's an environmentally annihilative project, and it's absolutely at risk for sea level rise. But beyond that, it's also about an hour, maybe even less, to the North Korean border. So this is actually also a frontier space. This is actually a landscape negotiating geopolitics between South and North Korea. Even though, like, when I asked, all the engineers at Cisco, I was like, well, what if somebody hacks this smart city? This is kind of like, you guys are kind of at war with North Korea, and then you've got the Chinese backing the North Koreans. And they're like, no, it won't happen, whatever, that's not an issue. And that's been a general thing. One of the interesting things when I asked engineers at Cisco about, whether or not anything would go wrong or what would happen if the city failed, either economically, it's also, it was an expensive real estate development, had a lot of economic problems at the start. There's also all these security problems because it's so close to North Korea, and there's a geopolitical situation, and there's an environmental problem. And they just kept saying, actually, oh, well, it's okay, we'll just build version 2.0. It's just a testing ground, an example, experimental, repeatable, a prototype. And now I take the moment to remind you that as of today, there's 500,000 people living. It's the size of Dresden already. So this is a really big complex. A lot of people's lives are here. So what kind of test or ground? In short, every single one of these cities is understood to be a demo. Its failure just a reason for another version. And today, it could be said that we're turning our entire planet into a test for technologies. Perhaps that's what it means to live in the Anthropocene. So we're kind of have this new kind of pessimistic optimism that's coming out. And one of the things that is also really interesting, coming back to our smart city, is what makes these cities smart, of course, is the vast amount of data they collect, and in theory monetize from the environment and the populations that inhabit them. So this is the control room at Songdo, and this is a pretty common IBM operations center. Just about every city has one. Well, I don't know if this one, but most large cities like London or Tokyo, a lot of cities have these today, actually, for running the transit systems, water systems, electrical systems. This is not at all uncommon. So this is the control room. It's sort of the world as interface. And what is astounding is that the monitors here serve no immediate functional purpose for human eyes. So actually, all those monitors, like, no one really can read the data. It's just performance. It's a showroom, because actually the whole thing is like a expensive store for other people wanting to buy cities, and to hire Cisco and POSCO to build your city for you, or build your infrastructure for your corporation. So this is really interesting that these are just aesthetic. They're not really doing anything. And the engineers and administrators cannot apprehend or act immediately on these images. Rather, all this traffic, environmental, and CCTV data that you see up here is being autonomously analyzed by IBM software and platforms and algorithms. So actually, the computers are doing the analysis, not the human beings. And if there's, for example, a problem in the transit system, the computer will probably shut the electricity or shut the thing down before the operator responds. So really, we might think that this is more for training our attention, just getting us used to being in this environment, to the direct non-conscious consumption of data, than it is then this is some sort of thing that we actually manage, or representation of the world. And this is now the infrastructure to derive value, or smartness. So this is a world where sensing equals smart, and smartness has come to mean value. Our networked infrastructures linked directly into our nervous systems. And of course, there are people like Elon Musk, my least favorite, or my most favorite person to hate, that really envision, right, like bypassing consciousness and hooking you right into the machines. So just like this, but we've also have in the past kind of Google Glasses, but in a more, and here in an even more kind of negative vein, this is a drone operator using an electroencephalography machine, and it was assumed that the brain fires signals a few microseconds before the operator clicks the image of interest as a target for the drone. So as these operators are looking at images, that you can actually, so by directly getting signals from the brain, the U.S. military hopes one can increase the number of images processed considerably, maybe by some 15%. So now this, of course, question of subverting actually conscious human decision-making is kind of a critical question in smartness, right? And not only in military applications, but also, of course, in consumer. So we might also want to think about these media-saturated spaces in the forms of politics. So what kind of politics are happening at the affective, the emotional, the manipulation of nervous systems hooked into media networks? So what forms of politics and economics, for those of us who, during COVID, well, I don't know how many people kind of took up day trading, but lots of people took up day trading. And anyway, you had these crazy, movements, right? Market movements, literally because of the way we're kind of hooked into these media systems, and the way that also these media systems are mobilizing our emotions, our nervous systems, our attention. So I open with these scenes because they prompt serious questions about both attention, politics, and economics, as well as our current built environment. And there are two connections I want to make in this talk between computing as a route to survival and the emergence of new forms of architecting perception and cognition, or perhaps what we might label platform or cognitive capitalism. So I don't know if you guys have been talking about platforms at all in this class. All right, so today we'll be starting that conversation. So, maybe you've heard the word of platform capitalism, a bit about platforms, right? So, a lot of this is about, like, how do we think about this condition where we're part of a whole network or platform of technologies, techniques, ideologies. They're all kind of networked together, right? And that we're kind of part of a network, literally hooked into, and that it's, our environments are so ubiquitously full of computing. How do we kind of gain some sort of conscious purchase or agency, right? So like my music system, my hearing, my vision, my everything are being mediated, all mediated by the same corporation, right? So I'm on an Apple computer, and all my data's on the Apple computer, and my music's on the Apple computer, and my movies are on the Apple computer, and everything I buy is on the Apple computer and I Apple Pay. And so you can see, right, that there's quite an infrastructure there that knows a whole lot about me, but that also I'm extremely dependent on, right? So that's kind of what we mean when we're talking about platform capitalism, is the kind of integration of a lot of forms of a lot of elements of our lives, our daily lives, into usually corporately owned infrastructures. And so there's really questions of what it means when we're jacked in from the nervous system on into these technologies. In short, how did structural issues like climate change, social volatility, political insecurity, and terror all turn into issues of personalization, responsiveness, and human-centered design, right? So like lots of things are going on in the world, but we experience them through these machines and through our networks. And a lot of times it's, you know, it kind of feels like it's about us. No matter how geopolitical and large it is, we really have this this kind of turn to personalization. Like my social networks, there's a lot of conversations about polarization in politics, right? Like that I only get the news from my friends, so I don't ever find out what anyone else thinks, right? I don't have to. So these kind of questions about how infrastructural and geopolitical problems become about personalization, interactivity, and sort of and technology are the questions we're really trying to think about. And please stop me if you have questions, because I know that obviously I'm speaking, you know, not in your first language, and I know I talk really fast. So feel free to interrupt. So so one place to think about the inevitability of this condition is through history. So I'm a historian, and I do something called genealogy, which is to say I look at the past of technologies in order to understand the present, and more importantly, in order to think about ways that we can construct different futures. So that we live in a carbon-based economy, the fact is it's not. Decisions were made at certain points, technologies were developed in one way or not the other, in historically situated ways that it's important to remember, because actually we still, well, not we, I can't speak for you, but ultimately, right, I still want to change the world and make it more equitable, diverse, and caring. And so it's really important for me to remember that everything has a history and everything changes. So today's a small case study demonstration of how I work, and to explore the themes in my research, I want to discuss a small part of my new work on history of responsive environments. And so today, to think about the history of all of this, I'm going to turn to probably something you are way too young to remember. But anyway, Nicholas Negroponte loomed very, very large in the 80s and 90s. He started something called the Media Lab at MIT. I don't know if any of you have heard of that. Certainly you've heard of MIT, I'm assuming. And anyway, he had a famous statement, which was demo or die, that we have to demonstrate our technology or apparently drop dead in a kind of neoliberal new university structure that was going to develop technology. And then he said something really famous or really interesting: computing isn't about computing anymore, it's about living. And that's really the motto of this thing, is that we can't be thinking about computers anymore like this, right? Computers and computing and digital media aren't just technologies. They're not just this. They're not just my cell phone. They're not just these objects, right? They're also networks of ideas. They're what we call epistemology, how we know the world, right? Like Google Maps isn't just showing me the representation of some reality, it's also showing me a world that I think I can manipulate, that every time I can find what to buy or where to go. These are attitudes to the world. They're what we call epistemologies. There's a way we know the world. So they're also, of course, they're also material, right? There's heavy metals in here. There's an entire political economy of labor and materials that's in this cell phone that stretches from Foxconn in China to cobalt mines in the Congo, right? So, and we know this, right? Or I think you know this. Well, now you know this. And so there's a geopolitics to this. So digital media is a way of being in the world that isn't locatable just in technology. It's how we know the world. It's how we represent the world, and very often how we act in the world. So, and it far extends. So I want to take this, to ask about this demo. So I want to ask about this statement, and I want to ask about this history that has had so much to do, because obviously the Media Lab was one place that pioneered a lot of the contemporary technologies and attitudes to developing computing that are of interest to us today. So to ask about its demo and its stakes, I want to open with one of my better, in my opinions, artistic elaboration. So to open, I'm going to actually not open with Media Lab. I'm going to open with a discussion of a very famous German artist who maybe you're familiar with. He recently passed away, actually by now a couple of years ago, Arun Faruqi. So and I have the sound deliberately off here. Sorry, it's going a little slow. So in a recent piece, Serious Games 1-4 from 2011, filmmaker now deceased, Arun Faruqi cuts onto 4 screens different scenarios of recent wars and war games. And of course, a lot of this talk is going to be about war, so it might resonate also with our contemporary situation, since we are indeed in the midst of a very large war. In the longest segment, filling 2 channels titled Immersion, we see juxtaposed between images of war, simulated and mediated, a soldier undergoing post-traumatic stress disorder therapy for experiences in Iraq through living the memory in a simulated game. So you can kind of see down in this lower thing, this kind of soldier going through psychological therapy. In watching this piece, what is immediately clear is that the viewer is torn between learning how to use and see all the images in this installation and producing some sort of coherent story or diegetic upon which to focus. The horror of the scene is the way in which pre-battle training and post-battle therapy, post-trauma treatment are strikingly similar. And the conclusion one might garner is that we are being conditioned to never experience war as pain or trauma. The trauma of being unable to feel care or empathy for others is doubled in that the installation itself creates various barriers to proximity with its chosen subject of war. The viewer is being trained, so to speak, to shift attention between screens rather than actually look at any one of them. So one of the things is when you're in this multi-channel installation, which sometimes gets replayed, you're bombarded by a lot of screens. So you're not really focusing. It's not like watching a single movie in a cinema, right? You're kind of watching all these different screens of war being simulated as a training for soldiers to go out to war, and war as being re-simulated as a way to get over the trauma of war in a kind of ironic feedback system. So Faruqi's work reveals, though, how our very vision and cognition is now so thoroughly mediated, that we're always mediated in how we see, that in many ways it's mechanized as to be perhaps even inhuman, that we're learning to see like machines, that we're constantly looking at images produced by machines, around machines, and so forth. By implication, the PTSD treatment's very practices indicate that the place of the screen is no longer about human subjectivity. It's not anthropomorphic. It doesn't show us anything about the world outside or represent anything, right? These are all simulations, but this is now a world where there is no difference, right, between the simulation and the reality. It's all become, if you will, computationally mediated. But it's a conduit. Every time we see the images, it's a conduit where the familiarity of an event is used to simply subvert the trauma, rewire the nervous system, and increase the compatibility between the subject and the network and the consumption of data. So the implication Faruqi makes in this piece is that, like, we're constantly being trained to be part of machine systems. And that actually we can't, instead of being traumatized, we're just being fed back these images so that we work through the trauma. Nothing can enter the realm of experience. And we can go back after the military, treats these soldiers, they send them right back to go back into war, right? And I opened with Faruqi's piece because it's essentially a reenactment of contemporary PTSD treatment through gaming in the military, and it reperforms perhaps one of the most famous and pioneering models built in the late 1970s for creating immersive environments and implementing pre-battle cognition and strategic knowledge in the military, the Aspen movie map of 1978, built by the Architecture Machine Group at MIT, which then later became the MIT Media Lab. And I open with it because it's a classic study in how attention and security have been married in a way that anticipates our contemporary smart cities and responsive environments. And in fact, arguably one of the most important locations influencing the design of contemporary smart cities, the Songdos of the world, was this Architecture Machine Group that you're going to hear about at MIT Media Lab. And in fact, the chief engineers for Cisco on that complex all were trained at MIT. So there's quite a relationship. And I want to emphasize the global dimensions of these methods, as I mentioned, so because practices move between locations, right? And are co-produced. So while MIT produced most of the engineers, Songdo is now feeding back into New York City and many other cities globally throughout the imaginaries and management strategies of contemporary urban planning, policing, and logistical systems. And South Korea has kind of created a product out of building smart cities. And here in Germany or in Europe, there's like a huge hysteria about smartness. Like a lot of smart things are supposed to be built. All the cities are supposed to become smart. And there's a lot of like crossover and discussion with urban planners and designers from East Asia. So let's take a look at how we got to this place where demoing and dying got connection. So I'm really interested in this idea of the demo because it preludes prototyping, versioning, all these kind of practices that are so key to the digital economy. And they're also and so key to high tech and creative industries. And it's kind of a history of a new form of creating a practice, a new way to cultivate and inhabit computing, and a new mode of knowing that also allowed us to envision creating entirely computationally generated environments. So I want to really think about this history of how we turn the world into a computational demo for technology. So as I mentioned, the Architecture Machine Group was one of the most important places influencing perhaps what we might call responsive environments today. And one of the first operative models that you see behind me for fully computational immersive environments is often cited as the Aspen movie map of 1978, built by this team at MIT. Now I'm going to show, built through a careful survey of Aspen, a fancy resort town in Colorado, using gyro-stabilized cameras. It took an image every foot traversed down the streets. It was a system working through a joystick and computer that would allow the user to traverse the space of Aspen at their leisure and speed. The film was shot both backward and forward, so you can navigate in reserve. And you can see that there's like multiple types of mapping. So you can have a map of the space on top while you're kind of navigating inside the kind of what looks today for a first-person shooter game or something like that. So there's a temporality of this place because you can go back and forth, and you can also place objects in the space. There's also a scalar component, as I mentioned. And so you can see the system through abstract modes, through an abstract map and through the space. And of course, the space is being totally cut up, and there's different ways to navigate this geography. The effect Negroponte said of being in this system was to have so much recorded that the experience was seamless. There are no computers to be seen. This is not a model, it is Aspen. As Michael Neymark, an artist who worked on the project, has written and who I've interviewed, Aspen is a verb, not a place. That is an amazing statement. So we're Aspenizing. So like space is now something we can manipulate. We do, right? Like we Googling, not just walking, we're walking. We're not actually, the space isn't just an object there to be represented. It's a way to live, it's a way to be in the world. This is the world as an interface. Originally, this project was commissioned by the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, now DARPA, of the United States Military Cybernetics Division. The military inspiration came from stories of the Israeli use of a simulated environment to accomplish the mission of saving hijacked Israeli citizens at Entebbe in Uganda, and here you can see the scale. So the American military was really impressed by the use of this simulation to train people for this kind of post-colonial situation. And they thought, oh, well, maybe we could also build simulations. So they commissioned Architecture Machine Group. But the project was not classified, so it wasn't considered a military project, and this feature recognizes another fact. Even as counterterrorism and urban warfare had become a pressing issue by the 1960s with decolonization, mandating new military strategies, there was another war going on. At least, and I'm a historian of the United States, so you're going to have to hear about the US. The urban riots in the late 1960s, sparked by the death of civil rights leader Martin Luther, the assassination of civil rights leader Martin Luther King, and increased tensions as whites fled urban areas, erasing tax bases and refusing to desegregate America's geography, economy, or politics, had prompted a new discourse of war and crisis in America's cities. And so much of the smart technology, at least built in the United States, is built around racial warfare and to manage race relations in the United States. So as it was felt that government was failing, and also people wanted to maintain what we call American apartheid, increasingly there was an interest in using technological, like maybe engineering can step in where politics would otherwise act. So that's a kind of critical feature in this history of smartness, at least in the US. So at MIT, urban planners and designers had long turned away, even before the 1960s, from discourses of the social to those of cognitive, computing, and communication science. So this is an image by Jay Forrester, really famous, one of the first kind of pioneers in computing, from a book called Urban Dynamics, where he kind of broke the city down into like a flow chart for a computer. So already in the 60s, people were like, maybe we can manage these systems through computers. And at MIT, that was obviously something they were pioneering, was really thinking about the computational management of large-scale systems, computers, corporations, cities, militaries. So at MIT, this was already happening, and a number of people, including like Kevin Lynch, he's an urban planner who is working a lot with cyberneticians, were really thinking about environments being comprised. You can see sort of flow chart a little bit in here. You can see those little dots, and they really were working on seeing the environment as a result of interactions between agents that could be modeled and simulated and then developed, and processing a sort of affective and cognitive character. So Lynch was really important in being like, we create all these cognitive maps of the city, and that the urban environment is an interactive one. It's not just out there, I don't just walk, I actually engage with this building in some sort of affective way, and people were trying to start modeling it. So this has been something that they started doing a lot at MIT. And in his path-breaking book, The Architecture Machine of 1970, Negroponte established this kind of new cognitive environmental idea as the centerpiece of rethinking architecture and urban design. So he said, computer-aided design cannot occur without machine intelligence. That must be behavioral, and it must have a sophisticated set of sensors, effectors, and processors. So if we take this statement seriously, then the history of computer design interestingly, is not based in a history of architecture planning. So he wasn't thinking about architecture at all. He was actually thinking about cybernetics and particularly neural nets. And today, at the time, neural networks were not operating because they didn't have data sets big enough. But today, obviously, A lot of deep learning goes on through this technology, and you can ask me about it. I'm not going to talk about neural nets, but a lot of my work is about the history of this neural net and the relationship between the brain and the computer. But Negroponte was really thinking about these new cognitive models and the forms of intelligence being posited here were also embodied, affective, sensory, and behavioral. Like he says it's behavioral and it's about sensors. So again, we see the rise of this equation where we see sensing making computers somehow intelligent. And this is a very different paradigm than other paradigms in artificial intelligence that were about linguistics and language at the time, and you can ask me about that as well. Most importantly, this quote makes us recognize that to be able to think responsive environments demands a reformulation of both reason, what it is to think, and what it is to sense, right? So we have to have a reformulation of these two terms in order to make the environment itself not an external factor to the subject, but something we can modulate and make a medium. This vision of computer-aided design highlights how questions of human agency and politics were reformulated in terms of interactivity, right? So this is a project that starts as being about a political situation, right? Entebbe, geopolitical, but it becomes about video games, right? And personalized interactivity. And so for me, that's a really big question. How did we go from thinking about structural problems and geopolitical problems to interactivity? And how have we reformulated politics in turn, right? Because so much about politics today is mediated through personalization of our networks, right? Like I only get the opinions and thoughts of the people that I suppose that are affiliated with me through my friendship networks on whichever social network it is I use. So this kind of thinking is really key. So this vision of computer-aided design highlights how questions of human agency and politics, right, as we mentioned, were reformulated in terms of interactivity, a conversation, according to Negroponte, with machines. And these themes of reformulating intelligence, agency, and environment across the human sciences and design are really central to my work in particular. So designers consuming these discourses increasingly therefore turn to personalization and interactivity as a solution, as I mentioned, to race warfare. The result being the rise of the responsive environment as a centerpiece for architecture and urban design. And in turn, Aspen, I jumped ahead. Aspen emerged as a solution, the supposedly first fully responsive environment. So it was a solution, right, to these kind of problems. An individualized but networked way to negotiate space, a new form of life to answer perhaps to the seeming ruins of modern urbanity, simulation that could become life itself. And this model is now considered the predecessor to many first shooter games, military simulation in both Battlefield and PTSD, and also some people say systems like Google Maps. So the world was, of course, not always a demo, and there's a prehistory to this responsive environment. In the early 1960s, the lab began with ideas of testing and simulation. First, architecture machine wanted to make computers smart, but very quickly they turned to making people more computer-like. And one of the first demos of how computers could aid urban design was an effort to engage African-American communities in the then increasingly tense racialized urban environment of Boston. So Negroponte argued that this approach would finally surmount politics and solve problems. So what they did is they started running these Turing tests. You can see these black men from the projects, from public housing projects in lower income projects in Boston, supposedly talking to a computer. But actually it's just this white guy, because they didn't have AI back then, so they were kind of faking it. So it's like a Turing test. So this white guy down here is actually answering their questions, but they can't see him. So they think they're talking to a computer. So they ran these Turing tests and asked them what they wanted from design and from neighborhood improvement. And as I mentioned, it was run through a human being. So the whole test is just a demo to prove why we need more computers in urban planning. And he says something pretty important here that might seem kind of obvious today, but at least historically, it was interesting. He said that these 3 user inhabitants said things to this machine they'd probably not have said to another human, particularly a white planner or politician. So that part's obvious. But then he says something really interesting. He said these machines would monitor the propensity for change for the body politic. And what will remove these machines from being a brave new world is that they will be able to and must search for the exception in desire and need, the 1 in a million. In other words, when the generalization matches the local desire, omnipresent. Now they're like everywhere. But of course, these machines were nowhere at the time that he was speaking, basically the late 60s, early 70s. Omnipresent will not be. It's when the particular varies from group preferences. So what's really interesting about this particular key is how ideas of norms and individuals, so if before we were thinking about like, who's the normal person, the standard person we're servicing, becomes instead about differences, that 1 in a million, the person who's the variety, the outlier, right? So this is a model that assumes that many different agents making minute decisions can collectively produce an intelligent or smart environment without consciousness. And a new idea of groups, right? Populations as a cloud or source of difference, a propensity for change. And that might not sound very interesting to you, and I don't know if this is kind of too kind of weighty, but this is a really profound difference because throughout like the 20s and 30s in sociology and stuff like that, when we thought about crowds, when we thought about groups, they tended to be mobs. Like there's like fascist populist groups, you know, the Horde, maybe you've read some Frankfurt School or Siegfried Krakauer's The Mass Ornament. And now crowds don't become bad, they become clouds. They become things we can use. They become things that have a propensity for change and something that can be kind of value added. So that's a really fundamental difference because today you might hear terms like crowds, clouds, stuff like that, big data, and all those things are based in the idea that we think that there's value, right? That suddenly that mobs or groups of people can become a kind of value added. So it's a real shift from ideas of there being like a standard normal to people being really interested in deviations and outliers as sources of change, of sources that can be capitalized on. So a whole new statistical thinking, actually, that came up. So I'm really interested in how this sort of crowd became a kind of crowd or cloud with kind of utility for engineering and for science. So this brings us to demo or die number 3. So now we have these wonderful clouds. We've kind of transformed politics into interactivity. Where else can we go? So at the very limits of IRB protocols with people, Negroponte and his team and architecture machine turned to a new frontier, arts. And another micro-world titled Seek in an exhibition done for the Jewish Museum's famous software exhibition in 1970. So the Jewish Museum in New York City had this famous software thing, and it was a real kind of big moment in computer art. The exhibit consisted of a small group of Mongolian desert gerbils. See the cute little gerbils? So now we've moved from people to gerbils. Or maybe... chosen according to Negroponte for their curiosity and inquisitive nature, and they were then placed in this environment of plexiglass blocks that constantly rearranged by a robotic arm. So you see the robot up there, kind of an early AI. The basic concept was that the robot, the mechanism, would observe the interaction of the gerbils with their habitat, the blocks, so like how they like to move them around and play with the blocks, and would gradually learn their living preferences. So it would eventually build them a nice city that they would perfectly love by observing their behavior and by how they moved the blocks. The gerbils were there to introduce chance and non-mechanical behavior into the environment, the unpredictable. This machine, Negroponte argued in an interview, was conceived as both a cybernetic world model and a behaviorist laboratory for observation and experimentation. And here you can see the actual installation being built by the grad students, of course, who do all the labor. And here's the catalog entry: life in a computerized environment. Can't wait to live there. All right. Anyway, now that we've arrived. The experiment, unfortunately, however, went quite badly. The computers for all the show constantly kind of collapsed and couldn't keep up with the gerbils. The problem ended up being both the software and the hardware. The museum almost went bankrupt trying to build this thing. And the gerbils in their computer environment, and what might seem as an omen, or perhaps really should be understood as a simulation we could learn from, confused the computer, wrought havoc on the blocks, and ended up getting aggressive, violent, and even hurting each other. So they kind of went crazy in there and started hurting each other. And no one thought to or could ask whether gerbils wished to live in this block-built micro-world, computerized world. I guess they forgot to ask the denizens of this place. But no matter, demo or die, the Media Lab motto. Within a few years, Negroponte changes the name of the Media Lab, publishes a new book, Soft Architecture Machines. And in this new soft world, the actual computer disappears from sight. So now we don't see the computer or the robots at all. The environment itself immersively connected to the user. An environment, Negroponte writes, that is to be full of responsiveness, individuality, and excitement, and that would be meaningful for people. This new approach was centered on a new structure that you see behind me, which is called the media room. This room had quadraphonic sound, seamless floor-to-ceiling displays, probably a couple $1 million of hardware running the room. It was an immersive environment, fully networking human sense and computation, perhaps an end of architecture into media. So like when we think about just turning the entire environment into a medium. This is another, and that's something I think a lot about. The Pioneer Project, one of the first three-dimensional environments, was the Aspen movie map, and I return to it now. As the questions of race, urbanization, war, and society fade into the calm embrace of interaction, we're forced to ask what it means to live in this eternally extendable computer-enhanced world. What had started, therefore, as game theories around military concerns and then the simulations of artificial intelligence has now become about total life. Here, personalization, right, replaces maybe political or subjective experience, and individual non-conscious response becomes the focus. As we watch the map slowly unfold, the video enclosing us with historical distance, we can see the idea of the self-organizing system now networked into our attentive system. The environment spirals away into the effective space of preemption. We await the next bend in the road, even as the network remains invisible. The user both highly individuated, so we're very isolated with our machines, right? But also constantly linked in, right? We're always on these networks, even though of machines and media. And so this returns me to Songdo. Is it any surprise this city of pure interface rises up to agglomerate literally nervous attention in the interest of turning it into money? And by the way, the idea here, which is still being touted to the Korean government, is that you'll pay with data instead of taxes. So this has actually been flouted that our attention could be some sort of currency, right? And if we think about certain other things happening right now in crypto and in other and NFTs and so on and so forth, like we really kind of might start seeing the realization, right, of this kind of political economy. A direct conduit where every interface is only a practice to enter a network, not a representation of the world. So we might ask also, like, what happened to representation? If everything's interactive, when do we get to stand back and kind of and try to gain some distance, right, from what we're looking at? This also returns us to art and to the small, sad gerbils in their excessively responsive environment. In this case, the logistics of computing had folded on itself to provide something other, but also radically nihilistic. So they obviously didn't control this environment. It didn't go the way they'd hoped. from what was intended, but in many ways, the internal paranoia of the gerbils might serve as an allegory. And I don't want to say gerbils and people are the same, but it seems to have some sort of allegory to kind of maybe to reactionary politics that happens in our increasingly networked lives. The essential question in my work, therefore, is how to encounter this demo testbed that has become our world. And the story of Aspen highlights how we need to think, of course, of how race and difference shape our, and postcolonialism not merely are represented, but actually constitute, right? They help structure the way contemporary medium are being built. And it engages with questions of how to encounter difference and complexity and chance within digital networks. How do we contend with being apart and being together in democratic and plural ways? Those are fundamental questions. So this returns me, just as the final 5 minutes of this hour talk, to Haroon Faruqi. And so I'm just going to run this for 1 minute so that you can look at it. Sorry.
So we're heading out on combo hour.
Sorry about that.
End of the day, dusty.
Yeah, I got it.
It's about like this. Very quiet, very peaceful, going through the desert. Been a long day, and didn't have any trouble now. That had me worried. I remember just feeling like something bad on that. And the first thing I noticed set me off was some small arms fire distance. So, wanted to shoot back, but didn't see anything to shoot at. Very helpless feeling, not knowing what to do. It was right then that we got hit by an IV on the right. Oh. I looked down to see how my buddy was hitting.
So in this moment, ensconced within the gallery, juxtaposed against so many other screens, Faruqi returns to something that I've not really talked about very much here, but is implicit in all discussions about preemption, cognitive capital, interactive media, but mainly historicity and also meaning making. How do we make meaning and create narrative in the kind of flow of big data that we're constantly immersed in? This is a kind of political question, it's an ethical question, it's how we will live together. If there's one thing that all demos that die desire, it is the evacuation of historical time and meaning. So the idea of the demo is that there is no history. We can just always demo another version, right? There's no end, there's no beginning. It's just version 2.0, and there's no implications or responsibility for what happens, right? I don't have to find out what happens to that city because I'm already on the next version. So if it fails, which could mean, crisis or catastrophe, this is not my concern. And Faruqi also recuperates what I've tried to do throughout this talk, the histories of race, violence, war, difference, and even gender that are necessary but never recognized substrate of our media systems. The installation does this by creating a strange effect where we hear the memory of the soldier in slight advance of our seeing through his eyes. So if you noticed, there's a bit of a temporal disjuncture. We're therefore allowed into the mind and eye of this subject while simultaneously being encouraged to view him as different or other than the spectator. We're interpolated into empathy, but we don't identify, right? So we know we're watching a simulation, and maybe even the whole thing is fake. So there's a whole series of steps here, but at the same time, we're kind of interpolated into seeing like this person does, right? The installation, while multimedia and channel, thus continually asserts our encounter with psychic pain, a drama we can suddenly see, almost because the other forms of information have been made so repetitive. It is in this moment where we share memory out of sync with media flow that we realize that we're being conditioned by this apparatus, right? Like that we're being taught to see through this virtual reality technology. This moment of encounter emerges not through a reactionary disavowal of the logic of contemporary digital media, but literally by embracing the demo. They're using the media and reenacting it. But we are not permitted to engage with the die of the demo element because we cannot complete the channel and we have nothing to consume. We are both alienated in a Brechtian manner, perhaps, and made intimate with pain, a double move that facilitates empathy without either identification or assimilation. So to finish, Foroughi once argued that reality has not yet begun. It has not begun because we cannot witness the death or suffering of others, whether animals or humans, with love. In saying so, he awakens us to the fact that the demos of our digital and electronic media are not simulations, because there's no world to which they refer or replicate. What our demos do is remove our ability to care and insert our ability to consume and analyze data. So I want to end with thinking about that. And I ended with, of course, an artistic example of how people can contend or rethink or remanipulate media to new directions. But of course, as media scholars, the goal of critical scholarship in artistic and scientific practices is to make media unstable and to turn to imagining new worlds beyond or exceeding the demands of war and consumption. I want to end then with a paraphrase that just makes us think, what would it mean to demo without death? And I'll end there.
Thanks a lot. We go offline first and discuss later.